this is the most impressive collection in one place I've ever seen, hands down. There's one theory, which is that Islam doctrinally has an aversion to depicting living things. And in fact, this is not in the Quran, but as in the case in almost everything in Islam, the majority of Islamic law and dogma is not from the Quran, it's from the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. And there's traditions that he said that whoever draws an image, or whoever creates an image, whether it's a drawing or a statue, will be asked on the Day of Judgment to breathe life into that image, and if he can't, then he'll be punished. So the idea is that here it's the sense that in creating an image of a living thing, you are kind of acting like God, and only God can create. That's one tradition. Another tradition is that the Prophet said that angels don't enter the house where there's a statue or a drawing of a living creature. What this led is to a general prohibition amongst Muslim scholars, sort of they're basically rabbis in the sense that their main job is not to be intermediaries between Muslims and God, because there is no intermediary between Muslims and God.
They're not priests.
Yeah, they're not priests. Main job is to be scholars. Their job is to study this Islamic scripture, preserve it, and then apply it to changing times. So in the kind of Islamic law that's developed by these scholars, there is a prohibition on depicting living things. Now, there's some exceptions to this, because a lot of Muslim scholars said, you know, if you, let's say, draw a picture of a person on a carpet, you know, you have it in a carpet, you're walking on this every day. No one's going to think that you're venerating this or going to worship this like an idol because you're walking on it. Similarly, you know, if you have a picture of somebody on the seat of your saddle, no one is going to think that that's going to be a potential object of veneration or of idolatry because you're, you know, not respecting it bodily when you get on your horse. So there's some exceptions, even in the high Islamic tradition. But the important thing to keep in mind is that, as in the case with rulers and powerful people all over the world, it's very hard for ethical and legal standards to be enforced on them, even by the elite. So throughout Islamic civilization, we know in court culture that there was actually a lot of representational art. In fact, even representational art of drawing the Prophet Muhammad. This was not always followed, especially in court culture, but in especially mosque artwork, you're never going to see depictions of people or of even necessarily of animals. I'm going to talk about the development of the Quranic text, because I know that sounds boring, but it's actually very interesting, at least I think it is. Because the Arabic as a language and as an alphabet actually is standardized and formalized because of the Quran, for the purpose of the Quran, of preserving the Quran. And so, as the Quran develops, you see the actual Arabic language and Arabic alphabet developing, and you start seeing the kind of problems that Muslims dealt with in terms of language.
What does the Quran say about community?
About community? Community is important. I mean, so the Quran talks about Muslims being one community. Believers are brethren. If there's fights between members of the community, they should reconcile. And it says that Muslims are khayru ummatin ukhrijat linnas. Muslims are the best, supposed to be the best community brought forth by God for mankind, and that they are ummatan wasata. They are a community of the middle way. But community is extremely important. It's one of the major themes of kind of the Quranic social vision.
What does community mean to you?
People who share your values and will take care of you when you're in trouble, and you'll take care of them when they're in trouble, and you pool resources to try and, you know, it sounds cheesy, but make the world a better place and survive.
Absolutely.
That's not a very well thought out definition, but okay.
I agree with you, though. I think that's the process of affirmation for any religion, including Muslims that work through that. Also, what inspired you to be here today and engage with the Smithsonian to teach this to the public?
I mean, that's my job. I'm an educator. So anytime somebody wants to learn about something, I do my best to be there to help them. And you know, usually it's students in my university or other universities. So I really value chances to talk to non-students.
What do you think is the greatest challenge in bringing people together?
Well, I guess getting them to come to the event. I think when you're talking to people, it's how to talk in a way that you're not going to be misunderstood, and not necessarily maliciously misunderstood. I think people just you tend to think that you're being clearer than you are. And I mean, I noticed that just in this talk now, I'm always surprised by I thought I very clearly said X and somebody thought I said not X. And it's tough to keep that in mind. I try my best, but that's why question and answer is good. It's always good to ask the person, is this what you meant? Because it helps prevent misunderstanding.
Absolutely, and I think you did a very succinct job of explaining the nuances of the language, and placing dots in different places can have totally different.
Dotting I's and crossing T's.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are dots here. There's no vowels. This is the earliest Arabic that we know. This is first century. This is probably from the late 600s of the Common Era. And this is what's called the Hijazi script. Hijaz is Western Arabia, where the Prophet came from. يولج النهار في الليل ويولج الليل في النهار وله يسجد الشمس والقمر كل يجري إلى أجل مسمى. What that means is God makes the day go into the night and makes the night go into the day. He sort of subordinated the sun and the moon, and each of them runs according to their appointed time. He's the one who makes boats go in the ocean, and he is the high and the mighty. If you don't sit around and read Arabic a lot, this is tough to read. It's legible once you know what it says, but if you took, a 4-year-old, 10-year-old Arab kid from school and say, read this, they'd probably start scratching their head. It's kind of like going into a church and reading Old English, that kind of thing. You can figure out, once someone gives you a few hints, you can figure out exactly what it says. This is the early script. You can see this is not elaborate. This is not artistically pleasant script at all. This is just business script. The mid-700s. This is what's called the Kufic script. And this is developed more artistically. And you can see it's really, it kind of has this powerful sense to it. But here you can see the dots are actually written as tiny little lines. And you have these red dots, which are the vowel markings. So here you have the vowel markings. Arabia prior to Islam and Arabia during the early Islamic period is, the only records we really have are from Muslims themselves. So it's a story that Muslims told to themselves, then transmitted, then tried to make sense of. And when I say try to make sense of, I mean because something crazy happens, like a weird event that happens, everyone has different versions of it, and then they forget something, and they get confused with something else they heard, and then if you try to collect all those reports together, you'd have to try and figure out how to put them together, what's reliable, what's unreliable, and you have a mishmash of material. That's exactly what early Muslim historians faced when they tried to compile stories about their own religion's origins. What becomes the Arabic script is actually borrowed from a northern Arabian people called the Nabateans. If anyone's ever gone to Petra in Jordan or seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and they go into that part where the night guy is, that's Petra, and that's the area of the Nabateans. They were Semitic, they spoke Arabic, but they were culturally Roman after around 100, 200 AD. So our earliest inscription of the Arabic language is from the 300s CE. And it's actually written in Nabatean alphabet, but it's Arabic language. Now, if you're getting confused about, wait a second, what do you mean written in one language and it's the actual thing being written in another language? Well, think about this. The word Quran is not an English word. The word Quran is an Arabic word that we write in English. So you can write any language in any script. You just have to come up with a way that is going to be efficient to get people to understand. Think when you're at a Chinese restaurant ordering, you're reading an attempt to communicate Chinese words in an English script or Roman script. Okay, so the earliest Arabic inscription that's in Arabic is from the early 500s, the Common Era, and it's a rock inscription in northern Arabia. And so that, by the time of the early 500s, we know there is an actual Arabic language, but it is highly underdeveloped. It's an extremely immature script. It's a defective script. By that I mean not that people who designed it or had problems or weren't good at their job, but I mean is when we think about the purpose of writing, we think that you can have, this is what writing is for, right? You communicate ideas very clearly in a lasting way to a large number of people who aren't just prisoner to hearing someone speak. That's not what writing is for in a lot of human history. It's not actually probably why writing was developed originally. Writing was developed to communicate very simple ideas about commerce and ownership and things like that. And that's what Arabic was for. Arabic was for early Arabs to basically talk about, I left 2 bags of camel feed with you. Please feed my camel, I'll be back in 2 weeks. That kind of thing. Or I'm going to buy 3 sheep from you, in return you're going to give me 2 goats. That kind of stuff. I like to think of it as shopping list language. So if you still write shopping lists out in your hand, and if you go back, if you find a shopping list from like 2 months ago or a couple months ago and you look at it, what the heck is this? What was I writing myself? That day it makes sense to you because you know the shopping list is there to remind you of what's in your brain. It's not there to be independent storage for information. That's the purpose of early Arabic. As you go over and you look at the pages of the Qurans here, you'll see a huge amount of marking around the lines of the Arabic. You can think of Arabic script as lines and dots. You'll see dots, you'll see lines, you'll see a lot of little slashes and loops and stuff. The original Arabic script was just lines. So you'd have something like this. Everyone can see that? This is how Arabic was in 550 of the Common Era. This is how Arabic was when the Prophet Muhammad, when his prophecy began in the year 610. This is what Arabic was. Now, this is the most impressive collection in one place I've ever seen, hands down. There's one theory, which is that Islam doctrinally has an aversion to depicting living things. And in fact, this is not in the Quran, but as in the case in almost everything in Islam, the majority of Islamic law and dogma is not from the Quran, it's from the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. And there's traditions that he said that whoever draws an image, or whoever creates an image, whether it's a drawing or a statue, will be asked on the Day of Judgment to breathe life into that image, and if he can't, then he'll be punished. So the idea is that here it's the sense that in creating an image of a living thing, you are kind of acting like God, and only God can create. That's one tradition. Another tradition is that the Prophet said that angels don't enter the house where there's a statue or a drawing of a living creature. What this led is to a general prohibition amongst Muslim scholars, sort of they're basically rabbis in the sense that their main job is not to be intermediaries between Muslims and God, because there is no intermediary between Muslims and God.
Priests.
Yeah, they're not priests. Main job is to be scholars. Their job is to study this Islamic scripture, preserve it, and then apply it to changing times. So in the kind of Islamic law that's developed by these scholars, there is a... This is the most impressive collection in one place I've ever seen, hands down. There's one theory, which is that Islam doctrinally has an aversion to depicting living things. And in fact, this is not in the Quran, but as in the case in almost everything in Islam, the majority of Islamic law and dogma is not from the Quran, it's from the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. And there's traditions that he said that whoever draws an image, or whoever creates an image, whether it's a drawing or a statue, will be asked on the Day of Judgment to breathe life into that image, and if he can't, then he'll be punished. So the idea is that here it's the sense that in creating an image of a living thing, you are kind of acting like God, and only God can create. That's one tradition. Another tradition is that the Prophet said that angels don't enter the house where there's a statue or a drawing of a living creature. What this led is to a general prohibition amongst Muslim scholars, sort of they're basically rabbis in the sense that their main job is not to be intermediaries between Muslims and God, because there is no intermediary between Muslims and God.
They're not priests.
Yeah, they're not priests. Main job is to be scholars. Their job is to study this Islamic scripture, preserve it, and then apply it to changing times. So in the kind of Islamic law that's developed by these scholars, there is a prohibition on depicting living things. It could be mulk, which means dominion. It could be milk, which means property. It could be melek, which means angel. It could be melik, which means king. It could be, what else? Muluk. No, that's not a good example. It could be meleka, a verb which means he owned. It could be mulika, a verb which means it was owned. So you could see that even if the short vowels are not always written, which they weren't in the early Quran, Arabic is a different way of thinking about language. It's a different way of thinking about language. If you look at this wall, we can, the Quran also describes God as the creator of the universe and of all living things. We could sit and have a long debate about what that means. But we all know what that says. There's no debate that describes is described. It's not described, it's not described, right? But what, I think I put the top here, thanks. What this means about Arabic is that it's and this is borne out by the way that Muslim scholars thought about the Quran. It's a kind of fluid language. Things don't, even something that's written that is a text, a set text that you believe is firm, is established, is unchanging. It's like it has different valences. It has different light cast different shades on it. And we'll talk about that when we discuss the different readings of the Quran. But that was kind of just an introduction to how the Arabic script developed in the very early period, within the first two generations, within actually the first full generation of Muslims. So by the early 700s, they had developed these, or within 20 years of the Prophet's death, they developed the dots for distinguishing between consonants. And when the first, let's say 70 or 80 years or so, they developed the short vowel markings. All of these developments in the Arabic language are for the purposes of preserving the Quran. That's what I meant when I said Arabic script and the Quran, they are linked intimately from the very beginning. This Arabic script is developed for the Quran. Another thing to keep in mind, the Arabic language is developed around the Quran. So Arabia at the time of the Prophet was it was like a linguistic ocean of different currents and types of language. So you had South Arabian, which is very close to Arabic, so it's kind of like maybe French and Italian. You had lots of different dialects in Northern Arabia, to the extent that some, it wasn't clear. There wasn't like Arabic language and then there's variations of it. There was no Arabic language. There were just lots of dialects that were all related to each other. Now the Quran seems to have been revealed in a mixture of the dialect of the Prophet's tribe, the Quraysh, in Western Arabia, and the dialect of a major Central Arabian tribe called Tamim, the Tamim tribe. That's what it seems to be, a mixture between these two dialects. But what happens is it's formalized in the Quraysh dialect with some borrowings from the Tamim dialect. Now, what this tremendous diversity of language in early Arabia meant was two things. One, Muslims who were at that point, well, the people who did the work were mostly non-Arabs. They were mostly Persian converts to Islam. In the 700s especially, they actually had to try and formalize and standardize the rules of Arabic. And so a lot of the Southern Arabian variations got kicked out. A lot of the different tribal dialects got kicked out. And people say, oh, Arabic has 100 words for lion or 50 words for camel. That's not just because people like lions or camels. It's because different tribes had different words for camel. So it's not just that you had, it's like going to different parts of America and there's soda, it's pop, it's Coke here, things like that. It doesn't mean that we all go around and somehow are able to use all these words because we have such a rich language. It's because it's regional variation. You get some kind of standardization in the standard language. The second thing they had to do was to figure out how to deal with this variety when it came to the Quran itself. Okay. So here's a brief history of the collection and compilation of the Quran. Again, there's no, it wasn't like there was a Christian Byzantine monk who happened to be visiting Mecca and Medina during the time of the Prophet's career, who was writing letters home saying, this is really interesting, you'll never believe what happened today. This, the earliest non-Muslim report we have about Islam is from the year 634, so 2 years after the death of the Prophet. And it's written in Greek. It's from North Africa, and it's an anti-Jewish text where a guy shows up from what's basically Palestine, and in the course of their bagging on Judaism, he happens to mention that this prophet has arisen in Arabia, and they've taken over Palestine and deposed the Roman rulers there. And he says, he claims to come in the tradition of Abraham, and he claims to have the keys to heaven. And he thinks he's the Christian guy thinks this guy's the Antichrist, this prophet, just to be clear. So, but we don't have a lot of information about the details of the prophet's life, except from Muslims. And so maybe you know the overall story. Around the year 570, Muhammad is born as one of the noble families of the Quraysh tribe, which rules Mecca, which is a local pilgrimage center for where different tribes have their local gods in the Kaaba, that cubic building. In the year 610, he gets revelation from God, telling him to read in the name of the Lord who created man from a little clot of blood. Read, for your Lord is most bountiful, taught man by the pen, who taught man what who did not know. And that's the first revealed verses of the Quran. And then he basically starts preaching monotheism. Some of, especially poor members of Meccan society, become his followers. They run afoul of the Quraysh rulers because they're threatening their pilgrimage business, their polytheist pilgrimage business. And eventually, after a lot of torture and killing Muslims, the Muslims flee. First, a number of them flee to Ethiopia, and then eventually in the year 622 of the Common Era, they go to a city north of Mecca called Yathrib, which is renamed Medina, the city of the Messenger of God. And at that point, the Prophet is actually the leader of a large community. He's a political leader, a judge, an administrator, and he engages in a war with the Meccans to try and basically be able to return to his home. Eventually the Meccans are defeated, and all the tribes of Arabia, by the end of the Prophet's life, have embraced Islam and joined the Muslim movement. And after the Prophet's death, there's this huge expansion outside of Arabia. Okay. Now, the Quran means recitation. The Quran talks about itself as a book, but it's important to keep this in mind. The Quran didn't drop out of the sky as a bound book or a scroll or anything like that. The Quran didn't exist as a book during the life of the Prophet. When we talk about book or kitab, it's not the idea that you have a written document that's between two covers or rolled up or something. Kitab means a book from God, a revelation from God. And that's why the people of the book in the Quran, the Ahl Kitab, they're the previous groups who got Abrahamic revelations, like the Christians and the Jews. They are the possessors of revealed knowledge. And by the way, in Yathrib or Medina, when the Prophet went there, it was majority Jewish, Arab Jews. And the people who served as the Prophet's scribes writing down the Quran during his life were educated in the Jewish schools of Yathrib. So they learned to write Aramaic and Hebrew. Okay, so during the time of the Prophet, he would receive revelations, and this would come down to him. He would start sweating sometimes. He would put his head under a cover. He would be almost physically shaken. This is what the reports say. And then he would recite what he had been revealed from God by the intermediary archangel Gabriel. And then he would tell this to some of his scribes, and they would write this down in just an informal kind of running collection. But the way that the Quran was absorbed and appreciated by the Muslims at the time was as an oral scripture. So some different companions of the Prophet had their own written, running versions of the Quran, but there was no official version. The scribes would write things down. The Prophet might tell them later, put this verse after this verse, put this verse in that chapter. So the Quran is not revealed chronologically. It's not written chronologically as we have it today, and as it's always existed. It's written as the prophet arranged it. And it's also not a narrative. This is a very big difference between the Quran and, let's say, the Bible. There's not the beginning, the middle, and the end. There's only one chapter of the 114 chapters of the Quran. Chapter number 12 is its a self-contained narrative. It's the story of Joseph. But everything else in the Quran, you might find segments that are a narrative. But it's really almost like a stream of consciousness if you read it. So sometimes it could be talking about the importance of believing in God, the importance of doing good deeds, fearing the day of judgment. Look at the signs of nature and the signs of your own history to see the oneness of God. Then it might tell you the story of Moses. Then it might say, and then people say this about Jesus. Then it might say, and they ask you about divorcing your wives. It's really just this, there's been a lot of effort by different scholars to try and look at the Quran as a literary work. And it's a really, I mean, that's a huge task. And there's been some impressive work done by scholars. But it's a different experience reading the Quran than any other book that I've ever read. Certainly not what the Judeo-Christian tradition is used to in terms of scripture. The Quran is revealed piecemeal during the 23 years of the Prophet's career. And a lot of times it's revealed dealing with a specific issue that comes up or talking about an event that's happened, let's say a battle that was fought or a dispute between the Muslims, amongst the Muslims. Sometimes it's just giving guidance, sometimes it's giving laws. And the Quran actually talks about this. It says, they ask you, the opponents of the Prophet ask you, Muhammad, why doesn't it come down as one book at one time? And the answer that God gives is, thus do we make firm your hearts. So the idea is that the Quran, by coming down in response to issues, is able to answer questions, not just give one kind of dispensation and then let people argue about it. So, like as I said, during the time of the Prophet, there is no Quran. There is no one written version of the Quran. It's only during the reign of the first caliph, Abu Bakr, who was a close friend of the Prophet, one of his earliest followers. He reigned from 632 to 634. There's a battle that's fought, and I'm not going to do something that the Prophet didn't do. But then he thinks about it and he realizes this is important to protect the Quran. And so he orders Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit was one of the scribes of the Prophet in Medina, who was educated in the Jewish schools of Medina, who knew Syriac and Hebrew. And, of course, he could write Arabic, and as it was at the time, he orders him to go and compile the Quran. And what he does is he goes around and he finds, for all the different companions who memorize the Quran, he makes sure that for every verse, or someone who claims there's a verse of the Quran, that there's two people who witnessed this be revealed, and that there's at least one written, someone who's made a written record of this verse. And then that's compiled into one Mus'haf. Mus'haf is originally, actually, it's a Ethiopic word. By the way, when I talk about early Arabia was really linguistically diverse, this is what I mean. Ethiopic, so even today, Ethiopian languages are Semitic languages, but back then they were really close to Arabic. So a lot of words, especially involving writing and preaching, were actually from Ethiopic. Even in the Quran, you have words that are from old Ethiopic languages. Okay, so the Mus'haf means pages, basically bound pages. Why, you might ask, was there not some formal written version of the Quran for the life of the Prophet? Well, writing was extremely difficult. Today, writing is easy. You go and you buy a bunch of paper and you write stuff down. Paper didn't exist. It only existed in China, and it didn't come into the Middle East until around 790 of the Common Era. If you wanted to write something down, you had to write on parchment, treated animal skin. You had to write on papyrus. These are very expensive. Very expensive. And Mecca and Medina were extremely poor places. They're basically subsistence economies, extremely poor. So most of the writing that was done on the sheaths of palm trees. If you go to a palm tree and there's this, if they're not manicured well, you get these ugly kind of cardboardy like things that grow out of the trunk. If you actually rip one of those sheets out, it's really fibrous, but you can scratch writing on it. They would also write on broken pieces of pottery. They would also write on these shoulder bones of camels. You can imagine trying to read a Quran that's written on shoulder bones of camels for your bedtime reading, right? This is going to be very difficult. So writing is not something you do. You don't have your own massive collection of written records. So the earliest copies of the Quran that one compiled by Zayd ibn Thabit was done on parchment, on animal skin. And then what happens is, during the reign of the third caliph, Uthman, another early convert, close friend of the Prophet, he rules from 644 to 656. So by that time, Muslims have taken over, by 650 they've taken over all of what we consider the Middle East, most of North Africa. They've gone all the way into what's today Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and Central Asia, taken over all of Iran, the Caucasus. And what happens is that there's reports come back to Uthman, the caliph, that people are reading the Quran in different dialects, different Arabic dialects. And he gets concerned about the potential variation in the book, so he orders one official promulgated version of the Quran. And it's unclear exactly, was that based on the existing version done by Zayd ibn Thabit, or did you just consult it? What happened? Either way, he creates a consonantal text. Remember when I wrote out the consonants? Not the vowels, the consonants were standardized. That was promulgated throughout the Muslim world, and all the other versions were destroyed. We know some of the Muslims preserved some of the variations that had come into existence. For example, in Kufa, there was one of the companions of the Prophet had his own mushaf of the Quran, and there were some variations in wording. For example, in one verse of the Quran it says, when the Friday prayer is called, فَاسْعُ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, hasten to the remembrance of God. In this Kufan version it says, فَأَمْدُ إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, go to the remembrance of God. A different word, instead of hasten, kind of walk to or go to. So the same general meaning, just one word difference. So from that point on, the consonantal text is standardized, around 650 of the Common Era. And that's the case until today. Now, of course, as you learned, that doesn't mean that what the actual reading of the Quran is standardized, because there's still dialectical variation. And there's apparently, according to what we know, that variation was allowed by the Prophet. Because, it would be like if you had someone from rural Arkansas and someone from the Bronx and someone from Southie and Boston, and they're all reading the Gettysburg Address. They're reading the same thing, but you're going to have different pronunciations of that. So in one sense, it's understandable that you'd have variation. But in Arabic, some of that variation actually can change the meaning very subtly. So, for example, I gave you the case of that word MLK. So the Quran talks about two MLKs, Harut and Marut, who came to Earth and basically kind of got into trouble and were punished by God. Now the standard voweling is melek, two meleks, two angels. And this is, by the way, harking back to some midrashic tradition in Judaism, kind of Hellenistic period Judaism, of how evil comes into the world. It comes into the world by intermingling between angels and human beings. But there's a problem here theologically, because according to Islamic theology, angels don't have free will. Human beings have free will. Angels don't have free will. So how do angels mess up? One possibility is God sort of makes this possible for these two angels because it's part of God's plan. The other possibility is that they are not two meleks, they are two meliks, which means two kings. And them getting in trouble is more understandable. So you can see how some of these readings, just another example, we probably have to end soon. I don't even get to show you anything. I've just been talking the whole time. But you can look at all this stuff by yourself. Another good example is over the issue of whether or not God can create evil. So the one verse of the Quran says, we seek refuge from God, or with God, we seek refuge with God, min sharri ma khalaq, from the evil of what He created. So that's the general opinion of, let's say, in Sunni Islam, is that God can create evil because God does whatever He wants. And you can't say God's unjust because God is the definition of justice. There's no external definition of justice you can hold God accountable to. So, but there's one group of Muslims, there was a minority that said, no, God cannot create evil. So what they said, it's not min sharri ma khalaq, from the evil of what He created. It's min sharrin ma khalaq. What that means is, we seek refuge with God from the evil He did not create. So it's all that is just in the voweling. Now,
yeah, but it divides people.
What do you mean?
You create sex and.
Well, that's so my point is that sometimes these vowelings can create differences of interpretation. Right? But unlike, let's say, English, the differences of interpretation aren't because I think king means one thing and you think king means another thing. It's because you think it says king and I think it says angel. But these are actually not that common. The big diversities and disagreements and causes for disagreements amongst Muslim scholars in Islamic law and theology are not because of variations in the reading of the Quran. They're really because of disagreements over things attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, and then just general principles of what is possible and what's impossible for God, kind of rationally. Right? So those are the main disagreements, not the voweling of the Quran. I just wanted to give you those as examples. What you see in some of the oldest pages of the Quran that have been preserved, especially some that were found in the roof of the Great Mosque in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, in 1979, you can't just throw Quranic writing in the streets. You have to burn it or throw it in the ocean. If you have a bunch of pages with Quranic language written on it, you sort of don't know what to do with it. It's kind of like when you have some receipt you think you're going to need and you just end up putting it, you just get it, it just sits on the shelf somewhere for 2 years. It's sort of, they just stuffed it in the roof, the ceiling area, crawl space, and it's basically garbage. Literally, it's garbage, but they didn't know what to do with it. But what it has is some extremely early pages from Quranic writing, and on some of them you see that the pages are framed with this very primitive architectural design of a building, which is very similar to existing artistic styles there, and also from Armenian Christianity, which is really weird. The canon tables at the beginning of Armenian Bibles at the time. The artwork, the tile mosaic artwork of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus is a representation of these buildings and gardens, and there's different theories that it's the Muslims trying to represent paradise. But whatever, you'll see this sort of similar vegetal design as you see here. That artwork was done by Byzantine artists, built by Muslims, but the people they brought in to do the tile work were Byzantine artists. This is important to remember. Early Muslims were an extreme minority. Iraq, in the year 800, Iraq was only 18% Muslim. It didn't become majority Muslim until the 1000s. Egypt didn't become majority Muslim until the 1100s. Iran didn't become majority Muslim until the 1000s or 1100s. So Muslims for many, many centuries were a very small number of people ruling over massive non-Muslim populations that only gradually converted to Islam. And initially, the attitude of Muslim rulers, they didn't actually want people to convert because then they wouldn't get taxes from them. They wouldn't pay as much taxes. And two, I don't think this is a religiously correct belief. And in fact, this had to be corrected by one of the early caliphs in the year around 720. He had to correct this policy. If you converted to Islam but weren't Arab, it was actually very hard to get that conversion recognized. They were still charging you the non-Muslim tax. And so in 720, the Umayyad Caliph Omar II, he said, no, everybody who converts to Islam is to be treated equally. But they initially didn't really want Muslims. When they conquered the Middle East, they mostly set up cities outside existing cities because they didn't want to mix with the local people very much. So the Quran talks about Muslims being one community, and it says that Muslims are ummatan wasata. They are a community of the middle way. Community is extremely important. It's one of the major themes of kind of the Quranic social vision.